They say history repeats itself, but no one ever imagined it would look like this. For 77 years, Gaza was the face of suffering, of shattered walls and silenced cries. But now, something has shifted. The images that once came out of Gaza are now coming from Tel Aviv. The fear that once gripped Palestinian children now haunts Israeli streets. One Iranian strike turned the world upside down, and in doing so exposed everything the media tried to hide. Every double standard, every lie, every illusion of superiority. This isn't just about war. It's about awakening. It's about a moment when the oppressed stopped whispering and started echoing across the sky. What you're about to hear isn't just a speech. It's a truth the world has been too afraid to admit. So sit down, breathe, and listen closely, because by the time this ends, you won't see the world the same way again. 77 years ago, in the aftermath of the Second World War, the world witnessed the birth of a nation born from the ashes of a people who had suffered deeply, Jews who had faced unimaginable horrors in Europe. The Holocaust had scarred history forever, and with global sympathy, the State of Israel was established in 1948. It was portrayed as a safe haven, a land where never again would its people live in fear. Survivors arrived, displaced and broken, clutching hope like a fragile lifeline. They were promised security, justice, and a future where pain would be behind them. The world nodded in agreement, carrying a collective guilt. But as years passed, the narrative took a different shape. The land chosen for their refuge wasn't empty. It was already home to a people with centuries of connection to the soil, Palestinians. What followed wasn't a peaceful coexistence. It became a story of dispossession, forced evictions, refugee camps, walls and checkpoints. Gaza became a symbol of confinement, resistance, and repeated devastation. Fast forward through decades of conflict, settlements, wars, and a siege that turned Gaza into what some described as the world's largest open-air prison, and something tragic happened. The oppressed had become the oppressors. The very cries that once echoed in Europe now found eerie reflections in the cries of children in Gaza under the roar of fighter jets and collapsing buildings. The symmetry of suffering was undeniable, but the world looked away. For years, Israel bombed Gaza with near impunity, claiming defense, and Gaza bled, year after year, with rubble instead of roofs, funerals instead of festivals. All the while, Israel was painted as the beacon of democracy in the Middle East. Its pain was recognized. Its fear was justified. But the same courtesy was not extended to the people of Gaza. And then, the unexpected happened. One night, one retaliatory strike, one show of strength that changed everything. Iran's massive retaliation not only shook the land, it shook the narrative. For the first time in decades, Israel looked like Gaza. Sirens in Tel Aviv, smoke rising from military installations, fear in the eyes of those who had never imagined this on their soil. It was more than missiles. It was a mirror, a reflection, a flashback. The imagery that once belonged only to Gaza was now seen in Israel. Collapsed buildings, chaos, and uncertainty. The irony wasn't just poetic. It was historical, because in that moment, 77 years of history folded in on itself. The oppressed had been heard, and the walls that separated suffering from privilege began to blur. It wasn't a celebration of violence. It was a moment of realization. That power, when unchecked, always comes full circle. That suffering, when ignored, demands to be seen, and that no nation, no matter how strong, can build peace on the silence of the oppressed. For decades, Gaza has lived in a reality that much of the world can't even imagine. Blockaded, bombed, and broken, the streets of Gaza are not just streets, they are scars. Children grow up not knowing peace, but learning to recognize the sound of drones, to hide when the power cuts, to sleep to the rhythm of distant explosions. Every few years, a new war. Every few years, more rubble added to the endless graveyard of memories. Hospitals barely function. Electricity comes and goes. The sea is poisoned. Even the sky isn't theirs. Gaza has become a symbol of survival, not because life flourishes there, but because death is so common, and yet the people refuse to die inside. For years, Gaza has cried out while the world watched with muted sympathy or complete silence. But something happened recently that the world didn't expect. For the first time, the suffering that was always contained within Gaza's borders seemed to escape. When Iran launched its massive retaliatory strike on Israel, a curtain lifted. The sirens in Tel Aviv screamed. The explosions in the sky above Haifa looked hauntingly familiar. The images that the world had grown used to seeing from Gaza, smoke trails, destroyed buildings, people running for cover, were now coming from inside Israel. And that changed everything. Suddenly, Israel wasn't just the force behind the bombs, it was now on the receiving end. The psychological shift was massive. For years, Israelis had viewed themselves as distant from the kind of terror Gazans face daily. Now, for a moment, they were pulled into that same world. The fear, the unpredictability, the powerlessness. This wasn't about celebrating destruction. It was about something deeper, about empathy being forced through lived experience. For decades, Gaza's cries fell on deaf ears. But when Israel began to look like Gaza, some of those ears began to listen. The illusion of separation cracked. The idea that suffering was always going to be someone else's problem no longer held. The pictures looked too similar. The sirens sounded too familiar. People who had once dismissed Gaza's trauma were now asking, is this what they feel like every day? And for the first time, there was a brief glimpse into the mirror, a reflection of what occupation, siege, and war feel like on the other side. The shift was not just military. It was human. For decades, Israel had existed in a position of dominance, its streets rarely touched, its citizens shielded by powerful defense systems and foreign support. But now, even that sense of immunity had cracks. And in those cracks, the truth began to leak. The truth that Gaza is not just a statistic, that its pain is real, and that no amount of power can protect anyone forever from the weight of injustice. When Israel looked like Gaza, it was no longer just a geopolitical moment. It was a reckoning, a sign that the lines between aggressor and victim can blur in the most unexpected ways. The night Iran launched its strike, everything changed. It wasn't just a military response, it was a statement written in fire across the sky. For decades, Israel had carried out operations with minimal fear of retaliation. Its enemies were either too weak, too divided, or too isolated to strike back in any significant way. But this time was different. This time, Iran didn't hold back. Hundreds of drones, precision-guided missiles, ballistic warheads, all launched in perfect coordination. Israeli skies lit up, not from fireworks, but from real flames, real fear, and real consequences. Within just 1 hour, over 100 projectiles had entered Israeli airspace. Strategic targets weren't just threatened, they were hit. Radar systems, air bases, command centers, the very nerve system of Israel's military felt the shock. For a nation long seen as untouchable, the strike felt like the unthinkable. Israel's famed defense systems, including the Iron Dome and David's sling, worked overtime, but even the best technology has limits. Some missiles got through. The psychological impact was immense. Tel Aviv, a city once shielded from real conflict, was now hearing sirens not as drills, but as warnings. The calm confidence that usually wrapped around Israel's sense of security had cracked. It wasn't just about physical damage. It was about what it meant that for the first time in decades, Israel was on the receiving end of a coordinated, high-level, state-backed assault that couldn't be ignored, deflected, or dismissed as another skirmish. It wasn't a random rocket from a resistance group. It was a sovereign power, sending a message that the region had changed. This strike didn't come out of nowhere. It was a response to years of provocations, assassinations, airstrikes, and sanctions. Iran had warned, it had watched, and then it moved with the precision of patience that had been simmering. In one night, the illusion of invincibility shattered. For years, Israel operated with the belief that its enemies would never risk an all-out confrontation. But now, that fearlessness had met its match. The skies had flipped. For once, Israel wasn't dictating the terms. It was reacting, and that changed the tone of everything. Diplomats scrambled. World leaders watched closely. The West, usually quick to condemn others, hesitated. Because this wasn't a back and forth with a stateless group. This was a nation-state challenging another. With the capability to sustain a confrontation, the military response was only part of the impact. The deeper effect was in perception. Millions around the world who had only seen Gaza's skies on fire now saw Israeli cities looking just as vulnerable. The power balance in the region had visibly shifted, and with it, so had the narrative. One strike had done what years of diplomatic pressure couldn't. It forced the world to admit that the status quo was gone, that the days of unchecked dominance were slipping. It was no longer a question of whether Israel could be touched. It was a question of how it would respond now that it had been. And in that question, a new chapter had already begun. When Gaza is bombed, the world barely flinches. Statements are made, condolences offered, but action remains absent. Over and over, entire neighborhoods are reduced to rubble, families wiped out in seconds, and yet the headlines remain cold, clinical, or worse, silent. The international community watches, but rarely intervenes. The United Nations calls for restraint. Western powers express concern, but nothing changes. Gaza lives under siege, without clean water, without freedom of movement, and with the constant threat of airstrikes. This has become normalized. The suffering of Palestinians, especially in Gaza, has been systemically dehumanized. Children growing up in fear, mothers burying their sons, fathers unable to protect their families. It has all become part of a narrative that doesn't provoke outrage, just resignation. The double standard is so glaring it has become invisible to many. But when the tables turned, when Israel was hit in a way it hadn't been before, the tone shifted overnight. Suddenly, the language in the media changed. The same outlets that were numb to Gaza's pain found renewed vocabulary for grief. Headlines screamed about Israeli suffering. Leaders around the world condemned the strikes on Tel Aviv and Haifa as acts of terror. There were emergency meetings, calls for support, vows of solidarity. The world that stayed silent for Gaza cried out for Israel. It wasn't just the reaction. It was the imbalance of empathy that revealed something deeper. It showed how some lives are valued more than others, how one people's fear becomes an international emergency, while another's destruction is treated as unfortunate but acceptable. This double standard has always been there, but the Iranian strike brought it into sharp focus. For years, Palestinians have asked, when will our pain matter? When will our dead children be mourned like theirs? The strike didn't just expose Israel's vulnerability, it exposed the world's selective conscience. It forced uncomfortable questions. Why is resistance from a colonized people branded as terrorism, while military operations from a nuclear-armed state are called self-defense? Why is there mourning for one side and justification for the other? Why does one strike from Iran provoke global outrage, while years of devastation in Gaza provoke nothing but tired excuses? This moment stripped away the mask. It showed that justice in the world is not blind. It sees with eyes trained by politics, alliances, and prejudice. When Israel looked like Gaza, the world didn't know how to process it. It was used to seeing Palestinians under rubble, not Israelis running for cover. But in that discomfort, something powerful happened. People began to question what they had accepted for too long. The hypocrisy was no longer hidden. It was out in the open, undeniable and shameful. This wasn't just about politics. It was about humanity, about who we choose to see, who we choose to hear, and who we choose to ignore. The Iranian strike, for all its destruction, forced a mirror onto the face of the world. And what stared back was uncomfortable truth. For decades, Israel held a position in the region that felt untouchable. Backed by immense Western support, fortified with advanced military technology, and empowered by intelligence capabilities unmatched in the Middle East, it built an identity around superiority, militarily, politically, and strategically. This wasn't just a matter of defense, it became part of the national psyche. Israel operated with the confidence of a force that could not be challenged. Every conflict ended with the same outcome: Israel standing tall, and its adversaries left counting the cost. The Iron Dome symbolized more than missile defense. It represented the idea that Israel was above the consequences that other nations suffered. That illusion gave birth to a sense of invincibility, a belief that it could strike, occupy, and enforce policies without fear of real retaliation. But when Iran launched its precision strike, the very foundation of that belief cracked. Suddenly, the narrative shifted. It was no longer Israel dictating terms. It was reacting, scrambling, confronting a reality it had long believed belonged only to others. The image of an unshakable state began to fade as missiles pierced through layers of defense and drones overwhelmed detection systems. For a nation that prided itself on always being a step ahead, this was a sobering reminder that power can't always guarantee protection. Military superiority is not the same as absolute security. In one night, the myth of being untouchable was shattered by the sheer scale and coordination of Iran's retaliation. And that moment created fear, not just among the public, but within the leadership, the analysts, the planners. Fear, once weaponized by Israel to control its enemies, was now seeping into its own borders. The footage of panicked civilians, of shelters filled with anxious families, of emergency services overwhelmed, looked no different from what the world had seen for years in Gaza and Lebanon. The superiority complex that had long separated Israel's reality from that of its neighbors began to dissolve. This wasn't just a military setback. It was a blow to identity. It forced Israel to see itself not as the eternal victor, but as vulnerable. That vulnerability is powerful because it changes behavior, it shifts strategy, and most importantly, it rewrites perception. The question was no longer about how strong Israel is, but how prepared it is to face an enemy that can fight on equal terms and beyond the borders. The world watched. Those who had been on the receiving end of Israel's aggression felt a shift. For once, there was a sense of balance, a realization that dominance has limits, and even giants can be shaken. The psychological impact of this moment rippled across the region. It showed that arrogance built on decades of unchecked power can crumble in a matter of hours. The strike was not just a message to Israel's defenses, but to its pride. The collapse of that superiority complex marks the beginning of a new reality, one where power is tested, not assumed, and where the oppressed are no longer the only ones who feel fear. There comes a point in history when events rise above politics, above military calculations, above territorial disputes, and instead speak directly to the soul of humanity. The Iranian strike was not just a geopolitical reaction. It carried a spiritual undertone that resonated far deeper than the sound of exploding warheads. For decades, millions have watched injustice unfold in the Middle East. They've seen children buried beneath rubble, families broken by occupation, and entire generations grow up without peace. They've witnessed the imbalance, the silence, the selective outrage, and the justifications offered in place of truth. But in the hearts of many, there remained an unshakable belief that oppression, no matter how powerful, does not last forever. That justice may be delayed, but it is never denied. The events that unfolded that night were a painful but undeniable reminder that every tyrant has a turning point, written not by generals or presidents, but by a force far greater. The Quran tells us that the prayer of the oppressed is never unheard, that when injustice becomes normalized, it is not forgotten, that even when the world turns its back, the heavens do not. And for those who have lived in despair for generations, whether in Gaza, in the West Bank, in refugee camps, or in exile, this moment felt like a sign, a moment that whispered, "Your cries have reached where they were meant to." The strike wasn't just retaliation. It was revelation. It pulled the curtains off the illusion of permanence that tyranny so often wraps itself in. It showed that no nation, no army, and no alliance is beyond consequence. That power, which is used to oppress, will eventually face the weight of accountability, even if it arrives on the wings of drones instead of the words of diplomats. Spiritual awakenings often happen through struggle, and this event became one of those awakenings for many. People began to re-examine what they had accepted as unchangeable. They began to question who writes the rules and who suffers when those rules are broken. The idea that some lives are meant to suffer eternally, while others remain shielded, was shattered. That night, millions saw what divine justice looks like when patience runs out. Not because anyone celebrates destruction, but because the balance that had been skewed for so long finally began to tilt. It reminded the world that history moves in cycles, that no oppressor reigns forever, that eventually, even the most fortified walls tremble before a higher will. This moment didn't just strike Israel, it struck the world's conscience. It asked humanity to remember that there is always a judge above all judges, a plan above all plans. And when the oppressed have nothing left but faith, sometimes that is all they need. Because from that faith comes a force that no missile system can intercept, no intelligence agency can predict, and no government can silence. The strike may have lasted hours, but the echo it left behind reached the souls of those who had nearly given up hope and gave them something they hadn't felt in years, a reason to believe again. 77 years after the birth of Israel, the world has witnessed a moment that will be remembered not just in military archives, but in the hearts of all who have lived under the shadow of injustice. For decades, power protected some while punishing others. But now, the sky that once only rained fire on Gaza has darkened over Tel Aviv. The cities that once watched from a distance now understand the terror of sirens, the fear of impact, the silence after destruction. One Iranian strike didn't just hit its target. It hit the illusion that might makes right, the illusion that some lives matter more than others. And in doing so, it shifted the balance not only of power, but of perception, of conscience, of history itself. This isn't about celebrating violence. It's about recognizing that justice, when denied long enough, forces its way back into the conversation. It's about understanding that silence in the face of suffering is no longer acceptable. The world has changed. The oppressed have spoken, and the message is clear. Truth will rise, even through rubble. What was once hidden in the smoke of propaganda is now visible in the fire of reality. Gaza is no longer alone, and those who believed they could build peace upon the pain of others now stand face to face with the consequences of that choice. To every listener, thank you for walking with us through this powerful moment in history. May your eyes remain open, your heart remain just, and your voice never be silent in the face of oppression. May you carry this truth with courage, and may justice guide you in all that you do. Good luck, and never forget. The most powerful weapon in this world is a soul awakened by truth.